In this video, we will be learning about something called the midpoint formula. The midpoint formula can be used when you're trying to find the coordinates of the midpoint of a segment and you have the two endpoints of the segment. So if you have 2 points, let's just call the first point x1, y1, and then the second point x2, y2. To find the midpoint between those 2 points, you would use this formula. So I'm going to say M stands for midpoint would equal x1 plus x2 divided by 2, comma, y1 plus y2 divided by 2. So essentially, you're just adding the x coordinates together and dividing those by 2, and then adding the y coordinates together and dividing those by 2. So let's try some examples here. So the first example says to find the midpoint of segment AB, and they give you the coordinates of A, the coordinates of B. So I'm going to call A my x1, y1, and then B my x2, y2. So to find the midpoint of AB, I'm going to start by adding the x coordinates together. So -2 plus 5, and then divide that by 2. And then add the y coordinates together. So -4 plus 6, and divide that by 2. So -2 plus 5 would give me 3. And then 3 divided by 2, I can either write it as 1.5 or 3 over 2 for the x. Then for the y, -4 plus 6 is +2. 2 divided by 2 would give me +1. So this would be where the midpoint of those 2 points would be located. So the midpoint would be in the middle here, 1.5, 1. Okay, number 2, again, it says find the midpoint of the segment, and it gives us the 2 endpoints. The only difference here is it just doesn't give us the diagram. So I'm going to call the first point my x1, y1, my second point the x2, y2, and then to find the midpoint, I'm going to add those x's together. So -2 plus 4 divided by 2, add the y's together, -4 plus 5, and divide that by 2. So the midpoint, when I simplify that, -2 plus 4 is 2. 2 divided by 2 would be +1. Then -4 plus 5 would be 1. Divided by 2 would be 1/2. Or you could write 0.5. That would be the midpoint of those two. Now, sometimes the examples aren't going to be as straightforward. They're not going to say find the midpoint. You just have to be able to recognize when to use the midpoint formula. So for example, in example 3, it says find the center of the circle, P, and P is supposed to be that point in the middle there. So technically, we know that if 2 points, Q and R, are on the circle and they're going through the center point, that would be considered the diameter of a circle. And we know that since all radii of a circle are congruent, P would be exactly in the middle of points Q and R. So we are going to use the midpoint formula to find the coordinates of point P. So again, I'm going to add those x coordinates together. So -6 plus 4 divided by 2. Then add the y coordinates together, 6 plus -2, and divide that by 2. So when I simplify, -6 plus 4 is -2 divided by 2 would give me -1. 6 plus -2 is 4, and then 4 divided by 2 is 2. So the coordinates of point P would be at -1, 2. This last example is one of the more challenging examples because it gives us the midpoint of a line segment and it gives us one of the endpoints P, and then it asks us to find the other endpoint Q. So first I would start off by drawing a diagram. So we're going to draw our segment and call it PQ. Then we're going to draw the midpoint of PQ. And that midpoint, it says, is at the coordinates 8, 3, with point P being at 23, 5. Since we don't know the coordinates of point Q, I'm just going to call that x, y. And then we're still going to use the midpoint formula to find the coordinates of point Q. So remember, for the midpoint formula, you're going to add the x's and divide by 2. So we're going to, again, look at the 2 endpoints, and we're going to add the x's together. So 23 plus x divided by 2, 5 plus y, divided by 2 has to equal the coordinates of the midpoint, which are at 8, 3. So now we're going to set up two different algebra equations, one to find x and one to find y. So the equation for x would be 23 plus x divided by 2 has to equal 8. And then the other algebra equation is to find y. So 5 plus y divided by 2 would have to equal 3. The first thing I would do to solve this equation is get rid of the fraction. So multiply both sides by 2. So I got 23 plus x is equal to 16. And then when you subtract 23 from 16, you end up getting that x has to equal 23 minus 16, which would be negative 7. Same thing with the y's, and I'm actually going to erase this and move it over because I'm kind of running out of space here. But 5 again plus y divided by 2 has to equal the y coordinate, which is 3. Then I'm going to multiply both sides by 2. So I get 5 plus y is equal to 6. And then when you subtract 5, you get y is equal to positive 1. So from there, the coordinates of point Q then would be located at negative 7, 1. And that would be your final answer. All right, that concludes our video. Feel free to ask your teacher any questions tomorrow about any of these examples.